Okay, week 3 problem solving model. So the weeks should be connecting towards each other, the MTSS, right, ISIL, and this problem solving model, the three kind of core foundations of all of the work that we will be talking about throughout this course. So the objective is to examine the model for problem solving, which seems like a simple thing to do, and most of what I will talk about feels real simple when we talk about it, but this is sometimes more like what our meetings are.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our team meeting. We need to discuss how Jimmy is doing in school.
Yes. Let's discuss Jimmy.
Let's make sure we discuss him for 45 minutes, so that we don't have time to discuss any other students.
Agreed. Do we have an agenda?
Heavens no. We will just discuss Jimmy until we run out of time. This is the sign of an effective meeting.
Agreed. Do we have all team members here to discuss Jimmy?
We do not. His teacher is busy and cannot attend.
Wouldn't she be an important person to have at this meeting?
Probably. Well, let's get started.
What about the school psychologist?
He is busy scoring 7 IQ tests.
Wouldn't he be an important person to have at this meeting?
Probably. Well, let's get started.
What about the special education teacher?
She's busy scoring 3 Woodcock Johnsons and cleaning up the seclusion room that a student vomited in.
Wouldn't she be an important person to have at this meeting?
Probably.
Probably. What about the school principal?
She's busy scheduling other meetings.
Wouldn't she be an important person to have at this meeting?
Probably. Let's get started.
Agreed. What do we need to discuss regarding Jimmy?
He is struggling with his academics.
In what area specifically?
Yes.
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 How do you know he is struggling?
I have a work sample.
You have a work sample?
Yes.
A work sample.
Yes.
A work sample. What does this work sample indicate?
He is struggling.
In what academic area is he struggling?
Yes.
What is the work sample a sample of?
It is a sample of his writing. It is hard to read his writing. Let's put him in special education.
Because of his work sample in writing.
Yes.
What interventions have you tried?
We have tried many interventions.
Such as?
I moved his seat to the front of the class.
To help him with his writing?
Yes.
I wouldn't imagine that would help him improve his writing.
Precisely. He didn't get better in reading or math either. Let's put him in special education.
How would that help?
It would be a seat moved even farther.
What other interventions have you tried?
I called his mother.
And did this help?
No, it did not. Let's put him in special education.
What other interventions have you tried?
But that's 2 interventions already. Are you trying to sabotage this?
No. I'm trying to use best practice. What other interventions have you tried?
I almost forgot. I also gave him response to intervention.
That's great. Response to intervention is best practice. What specifically did you do?
I gave him response to intervention.
You gave him response to intervention.
Yes. Isn't that best practice?
Well. Yes. How did he receive it?
Not well. Let's put him in special education.
I'm not sure that would be best practice.
Well, let me know how that evaluation goes. Thank you for this effective meeting.
So I'm sure that you have never attended that meeting before, but I definitely have. So let's see, let me get back to our PowerPoint. So obviously that's poking fun at what happens in our schools, but I had to show it. I haven't actually watched that myself in a while, and it makes me laugh because I do still sit in meetings where people will say things like, we RTI'd him, and that doesn't make a whole lot of, sense to me. So anyway, we want to ensure that we do have effective meetings and that we do have a problem solving process that really follows the 4 steps of the problem solving process and not just a teacher coming to a meeting and we are talking at that teacher, throwing strategies at that teacher, and then hoping it gets better. So we're just going to walk through the 4 steps of the problem-solving process and talk about why these are challenging, each different step. But knowing that if we want to be productive problem solvers, we're going to have to build systems where we have the allocated time and the appropriate staff to have these conversations. So the first step is pretty simple, except it's the step that I find my team skip most often, which is we need to define the problem. And really, what is expected? What's the difference between what's expected and what's being observed? Like, where is the gap? Like, what's the, what is it we're saying is discrepant from the peers? So the problem should be specific, observable, and measurable. If we do not make this specific, we end up trying to solve all the things of a child, or a teacher, in that's too much. So sometimes if we're working with really complex kids, we say, well, here's the 19 things that need changing or need to be, which is super sad in that super strength space. I mean, imagine if I was the parent sitting there and we can't funnel down which problem to start with. So we really want to define, like, what is it we're really trying to work on right now and be super specific. It needs to be something we can see. It needs to be something we can measure. So I think some of know that some of the challenges are that we do just have really broad problem definition statements. So, he has low attention, or he, is super aggressive. Like, we need to really say, when this happens, that happens, and this is why we think. So if we don't know what our problem is, like if we're not sure if we're focusing on physical aggression or if we're focusing on off-task behaviors, we really should gather that baseline data about the problem before we go to the next step. However, many times we don't do that. We just skip and we just go to the next step. And we really need to stop and gather more data before we know what we're talking about. And the other common challenge is making the replacement behavior goals too low or too high. So I see that often people make replacement behaviors for what we would consider to really be the acceptable behavior or the behavior of the typical. So the child can't even begin to establish that behavior because it's out of their reach. So the second step in the problem-solving model is problem analysis. And this is where we really want to determine what are the possible causes for the problem by considering all of the information we were talking about with the riot and the ISIL. So information related to instruction, curriculum, environment, and the student. So just linking those two pieces together, we want to make sure that we truly are stepping back and looking at all 4 of those areas and considering how whatever we defined as the problem. So if the problem is physical aggression, like how does it relate to these 4 areas? Of course, one of the most common challenges here is we fail to examine the environment. So it's, again, a lot of times we see the deficits or whatever we're seeing living within the child versus looking at the environment, even though we know that the environment is critical to influencing how a child does or does not behave. Just like with us, I behave differently at work than I do at home. And so why is that? Well, there's different environmental contexts around that. And so if we don't really examine what's happening in the environment, we're going to miss an opportunity of really understanding the cause for the problem. Failing to examine when the behavior does and does not occur. And so this is where, that baseline data can be really critical in understanding, it never occurs during recess and lunch. It has never occurred. What does that tell us about the behavior? It could be that with academic demands, the behavior is more likely to occur. Well, this is going to be super impactful in us making that next attempt at intervention, that next step, knowing that about the student. Another common challenge is we generate hypotheses about variables that cannot be changed. And there has to be, this is why when we do interviews and if a teacher or someone is consistently bringing up pieces that have nothing to do with what we can problem solve around, the parent won't medicate the child. The parent won't take the kid to outside therapy, stuff like that. We really have to work with our teachers to understand what things we can change and which things we cannot. And most of the time when we draw those boundaries around like, hey, I hear you that you're frustrated about him not getting outside supports. I love that you care so much about him getting what he needs. However, we can only manipulate the school environment. And I think like a lot of the stress you're experiencing will be reduced when we focus on our environment and let the family focus on theirs. Of course, we want there to be the connection. Of course, we want there to be a cohesive plan. However, we really need to make sure that when we are writing, what we see as the cause for the problem behavior, that we're focusing in on our environment and the things we can observe. Because a lot of times the things we assume about families may not even be true. And so that's problematic on several layers. And then the last challenge is we jump to solutions without looking at data. So we jump to the kind of what we think is the next best thing to do. Oh my goodness, if we just had a teaching assistant in the classroom, that would be fine. But we don't have any data to support that additional adult is going to manifest in a way that the child improves. So we've really got to stick first. Do we have a clear a definition of the problem, like the problem identification? Step one. Step two, what are the possible causes of that problem, and do we have all of that relevant information? So this is where you could completely dive into that riot ISIL, right? Here's all the data we need to gather before we go to the next step. And that next step is really going to be around implementing that intervention design. So this is really about how do we figure out like kind of the next best step of, focusing on, what is taught, how it's taught, and what is a plan to actually monitor and measure whether or not what we do next works. And that's not easy. It's definitely, you will struggle with, especially if you're trying to build too much too fast, monitoring how it's going. So again, sometimes if we do this problem solving process well and we reassure a teacher or a team of adults, hey, there's a lot going on here. Right now we're just going to focus on this one thing and we go through this process really well. It's going to feel much better than if we overwhelm the teacher and have her tracking or him tracking 19 different things at the same time. So this could be a targeted intervention in one area, and then here's how we'll know if it worked or not. Great. Instead of skipping steps and going to, building a comprehensive plan and measuring all sorts of different pieces. So some of the challenges that teams face with this intervention design step is that we select interventions that are not directly linked to the problem findings. I think we select interventions sometimes based on what's available versus what's necessary. In other words, you may have a student that the problem analysis findings really show you that they need, if we're talking about like an academic piece, that they really need intensive, reading instruction, let's say, and we don't have that available. So then we pick something totally different, expecting it to have a connection. I don't know that people do this intentionally. Sometimes we just have not slowed down enough to really ensure that the dots keep connecting. I will say one strategy that I use frequently with problem solving is a whiteboard. And I get a marker out, and it's visual can help people in many ways. It helps the brain see things in different ways. So once we've defined that problem, I might just keep that on the board. And I might keep the data next to that on the board so that when we get to this intervention design, we don't just start throwing things out there, but that I can keep saying, oh, wait, wasn't our problem we were addressing right now around X issue? That sounds like that would be more helpful for his attention issues. And so having that visual support is going to be super meaningful for not getting off track, which we're notorious. People get off track. People are overwhelmed. People have a lot they want to quote fix, which again, we're going to help them understand this is a journey. We're just going to start with one piece and go to the next step. The second challenge is that we select an intervention that's unacceptable to the person that's going to be implementing it. So this is really about the contextual fit of the intervention or strategy and ensuring that the person that has to implement it says yes to it. And that can feel really uncomfortable for, like, if I'm the social worker and I'm facilitating this meeting, I might feel nervous about that because I might not have other options, but it's super, it's really essential that I say to the teacher, it sounds like we think the best intervention would be to implement a token economy, and that you're going to hand them little cash, fake cash, and every time he gets this many bucks, he gets to hand it in for X. I have to say to that teacher in that meeting, how does that sound to you? Can you do this in your setting? And if they say, I really can't, then we have to keep talking. Now, if we have a teacher that has tier 3 needs themselves and they will not implement anything and they think all kids that have needs should just get into line, that's a challenge that should be addressed through other avenues versus just forcing them to do something they're not going to do. Let's be realistic and honest with each other. And so if that's the case, that's the 1 or 2% of your school building. You should be able to get the majority of your staff with enough options to be able to do something. So if you don't like token economies because you think that that's just goofy, great. What was that gonna do for that student, and how do we find another thing to do the same thing? Give them that say. It's that voice and choice. If a teacher doesn't have some voice and choice in it, that could be the resistance you're feeling. It's not that they don't like the child, it's not that they're unwilling to do it, but they feel like you're dictating to them what to do in their own environment. The teacher owns their environment. So make sure that you, as you facilitate that meeting, are checking back in and saying, it's your classroom. And when you say those things, it's so empowering. And if you've built that relationship with that staff member, again, you're going to leverage that relationship to get them to try new things, hopefully in the long run. Another challenge is that we select intervention procedures without getting the team or parent input. As a special education coordinator, there are so many occasions where I am brought in because parents are so, I would say, angry that things have progressed without the inclusion of them at the table. And that's just unacceptable. Parents and guardians need to have input. They need to be brought along from the very beginning of problem, defining the problem. Because the more that they are clear about what the school team is trying and working hard to address, the more able they're able to support it. And even if they're not supportive of, they don't see that Michelle has this problem per se, the more that we're including them on, hey, what do you think about a token economy? Do you think, the more that they're also feeling like they have some voice and choice in what happens with their child. And you, and maybe have heard people say, like, I spend more of the day with the kid than they do. Nobody knows the children better than the parents. And that's just a fundamental value I have that guides my work, because I just believe that. I think when we trust that people know their children, it just creates a better culture for this problem solving. And yes, it can be harder to have everybody together. Yes, it is hard work, but you're going to end up with a better plan. Because the more that you understand the strengths of a child and the more that you understand the context of where that child has been, the better that you're going to be able to come up with those interventions. And then the last challenge is we just don't implement what we planned. Like, we plan to do a token economy. 2 weeks later, we go into the classroom and there's a whole different situation going on than we had anticipated. The last step in the problem-solving model is to evaluate the progress towards the goal and the response to the intervention. So it's going back to that video at the beginning of the module. We used response to intervention. Response to intervention is just the model around we're ensuring that we follow this process and that when we get to the end of it, we'll be able to know whether or not there has been a response positive to what we put in place. So a really clean example I can think of right now is, a child that's having a problem transitioning into the school building in the morning, and you've tracked that, you defined the problem. He won't come into the building, into the classroom without having problem behaviors. Either he's getting into trouble in the line outside, between the lining up outside and walking in the building, he's tripping kids, hitting kids, and through collecting that data, you've decided to, run a new morning program where instead of lining up with the class, he's meeting and having a little transition moment at the front of the building with the school social worker, and then he's walking with her to the classroom. This last step is just to see, is that working for him? Is he able to enter the classroom ready to learn versus what was happening before? And so the challenges here that we face sometimes is we make decisions without enough data to show whether or not we had an effective strategy or intervention. Another challenge is not considering the teacher's acceptance of the intervention and the degree of implementation. So it could be like, this is where we have to not only evaluate if the student is making those gains, we also have to evaluate, did we do what we said we were going to do? And there are tools we'll talk about later in the course around getting people comfortable with saying, yeah, I know I said I would do that, but I actually didn't. I got busy, I didn't do it. And we have to create safe space for people to acknowledge when they don't do something, so we don't continue to evaluate student behavior when nothing has changed in their environment. Let me say that another way. We want to make sure we don't sit at meetings talking about kids not making gains, but pretending we did something when we really didn't, because that truly is not, that's not okay that we would do that to that student, because we actually haven't followed through and created a different environment for them by which to evaluate whether or not that problem behavior still exists. So it's super important that we find ways to honestly evaluate. Did we do it? Did we kind of do it? Did we not do it at all? And then the last piece is not planning for maintaining that skill, for either generalizing it to new and different environments or situations. So sometimes, like my morning routine, oh my gosh, that was super effective. But can we sustain it for the next year? There's another kid struggling in the morning and now the social worker can't help them. So we have to really make sure we're planning for what we're going to do in the long term. So with all that being said, what I would like you to do is to write a reflection about the last problem-solving meeting that you attended. And if you could share how the 4 steps were or were not applied in ways you might improve the functioning of the meeting. And it's okay, you can just say, if the whole meeting was just around problem definition, you can just say the meeting didn't apply to the other 3 steps. Again, if it was only about evaluation, but if you could give me that context for how the meeting either, whether you had an agenda, you didn't have an agenda, who facilitated the meeting, all those critical components and how it is or is not functioning in your setting, and just ways that you might improve the functioning of that meeting moving forward. That would be great.